Hello, everyone. Welcome. I see a lot of people are joining us today already, trickling in. So we thank you all for taking the time out of your day to attend our webinar. Today, we'll be talking about negotiating your salary like a rock star in the lens of public versus private companies. This yearly webinar is one of MLA's most popular, and today is no exception, and we're so excited to have us with you. My name's Lauren Horan. I work in marketing at MLA, and I will be the behind the scenes moderator today. We have our very own rock stars to guide the conversation with their insights and advice. John Norris, he is a partner at Duane Morris with the, John Nixon, I'm sorry. I was like, six rhymes. John Nixon. That didn't sound right. He is a partner at Duane Morris with extensive knowledge in employee benefits and executive compensation. Heather Fine and Casey Feldman are successful partners in MLA's in-house recruiting practice. Before we kick things off, I just have a few quick housekeeping items to go over. All attendees for today's webinar are in the listen-only mode and all cameras are off. As a reminder, the webinar is being recorded and we will send out a recording to everyone who has registered. You may ask a question and we encourage you to do so at any time throughout the webinar. Just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. All questions will be anonymous and obviously we won't share identity with the rest of the audience. At the close of today's webinar, a quick survey will pop on the screen just to let us know how we did today and what other topics you'd like to hear from us in the future. And with that being said, I will turn this over to our esteemed panelists to get things started.
Well, thank you, Lauren, for setting this up and supporting us and getting this done. This is my pleasure to be doing this. My third year, I think, doing it with John. I know we skipped last year because of a lot of things going on in his calendar and ours, but we're happy to be here again. So we'll just jump in. Lauren gave us wonderful introductions, just an overview of the format. We're going to talk about public company compensation, private company compensation questions. As Lauren mentioned, feel free to drop a question. We usually run out of questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can, we promise. But we'll kick it off to Heather, and we're going to let John have the floor today a lot because we all want to hear what he has to say. Heather and I are great, but John's amazing.
Exactly. Thank you, Casey, and thanks again to everybody for joining us. And John, of course, thank you. So, maybe just thought we could start our conversation out. You and I are going to talk a little bit about public company GC compensation, but can we start with some basics first, which is sort of who hires you, why, at what stage, and maybe is there a point that might be too late to hire you, right? So maybe explain your role in that context.
Certainly. And again, thanks, Heather, for inviting me. Casey, always great to speak with you guys. So my role is really as an advisor. I typically will come in after the candidate has really proceeded along through the process and has been identified as the leader in the clubhouse, so to speak. There is because I am a billing lawyer, I charge by time, and I don't want to waste your money, and I don't want to waste your precious time. So it's I try to make certain that folks know that it's your role as the candidate to hook the fish, and it's my role to help you reel it in and cook it and clean it, and then everybody eats. I mean, you eat, I eat, MLA eats, everybody eats, and it's a win-win all around. So I will typically come in, and I will say this as we talk, there's a sort of a specific world that applies to general counsel candidates, because that negotiation is very different. It typically is led by the candidate as opposed to when I do other C-suite officers. So there's some nuance to my coming in there, but that's a quick answer to when I am involved.
Perfect. Okay, and we might dive in a little bit more into kind of your role in that negotiation. But why don't we? So as everyone knows, we're dividing this into sort of public company and private company compensation. We're focusing at the GC level. So maybe what you can talk about when we talk about public company GC compensation are the components, right? What are the critical elements of compensation candidates should consider in the public company GC context?
Okay, and for some of you, who have been in public companies, this may be a bit redundant, but oftentimes I'm hired by lawyers who are coming out of private firms who've never actually had the sort of suite of compensation buckets that you will typically see in a public company. So there are three real buckets: base, bonus, and equity. The base is what it is. It's going to be within a range. The bonus will be within a certain range, and we'll talk about, how bonuses are structured and what are some of the considerations there. But equity is always sort of the weird, misunderstood piece, particularly folks who have spent the majority of their career in a private law firm, because there's really no analog. Even being an equity partner is not similar to the types of equity and the various forms of equity that you can see in a public company. So that's an area that you really need to kind of, educate yourself on, and maybe sort of have someone, be it me or someone else, help you work through. There are some other aspects that we see in public company. I mean, sometimes you may see deferred compensation, what we commonly call 409A deferred compensation. But really, it's in virtually every public company context, you're going to see those three elements: base, bonus, and equity.
Perfect. Is it, so you mentioned the 409A. I mean, do we even worry about other benefits, right? Like, I don't know, cars or memberships or other things that, are sort of not base, bonus, or equity related? Are those even things to think about?
So I think it's something you think about, Heather, if there's an aspect of it that is particularly unique to the candidate, if they are a member of an organization that is very important to them, if they, for example, are involved in a charity and they want the company to make a matching contribution to the charity. One of the things that is very important and increasingly important for lawyers is the ability for outside board service. And that is something that we spend, depending upon the candidate, we may spend a lot of time actually negotiating that piece and the language around permitting them to serve on an outside board. So, do I spend time negotiating the 401k? No, because by training, I'm an ERISA lawyer. The 401k is not going to change for you.
Yeah. Okay.
The health plan isn't going to change for you. Maybe you get executive help, but that's about it. But really, you're talking about those sort of three big elements of compensation, and then some things around the periphery.
Perfect. Okay, so let's talk about what everyone's very excited to hear about, which is negotiating public company GC compensation. So based on your experience, and there's a number of questions we have here, right? So we'll start with this one. You're probably going to get into some of the other ones, but based on your experience, what aspects of public company GC compensation are most heavily negotiated, right? And I'm sure there's a bunch of things that depend, but maybe let's start there. And then maybe what parties are typically involved in the negotiation.
Okay, well, I'll start with the second question because that's a bit easier. I always say that, if you go into a negotiation by yourself, just know you'll be outnumbered. And it could be, the counterparty could be the CHRO, it could be the outside law firm, it could be the chair of the comp committee if you're going to be a named executive officer, it could be the chair of the board, it almost certainly at some point will be the CEO. So you have a number of people who are lined up on that side of the table. Also behind those people, in addition to the outside law firm, will typically be a comp consultant like an FW Cook or Willis Towers Watson that is informing the comp committee on how the NEOs are to be compensated. So it literally is sort of you against sort of this army of people. MLA, the recruiter, is, sort of a studied neutral, I think. It's their role to bring you to the table and maybe facilitate discussion if there's a particular snag. But, and I've said this in front of Heather and Casey before, they are not your advocate. They may be your friend and, you may love having a drink with them, but they're not there to advocate for you. They were there to find you and to source you. And so you really kind of have to prepare for those counterparties. In terms of what is most heavily negotiated, I tend to think of it as, at least in the public company context, where you're going to fit within the hierarchy. Okay. Virtually, if you're an NEO and you're in the proxy, those ratios are going to be pretty set. They're going to be set pretty firm. So the question is, typically, you're going to be at or near the CFO. How closely can we get you to the CFO? So if the company walks in with a general comp structure for its non-CEO, CEO is always going to be heavily equity. But for the non-CEO NEOs, they may come in with a 25-25, 50% ratio, 25% base, 25% bonus, 50% equity. Okay, so if that's the case, and they're saying all of our NEOs have to kind of fit within those parameters, the question is, how can we argue to get you either at the number 2 spot or as close as possible to the number 2 spot?
Okay, perfect. That's actually really, really helpful. So where do you see a lot of discrepancies, maybe in the offer a candidate gets and what they actually need, or maybe where candidates go wrong and where there's sort of pitfalls in the negotiation? And, you know, maybe it's where the company's going wrong too, frankly. Like where do you kind of see the pitfalls overall?
Well, you know, everyone has to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get a call from Heather or Casey, you know, and they've given you a range, you kind of have to figure out, okay, can I live with that range? Because it does no one any good for you to say, yes, oh, sure, that's great. That would be a great opportunity. And then go in and ask for 30% above the range. That wastes everyone's time. And, you know, the job may not be the job for you. Or conversely, you may decide the total comp package isn't what I need, but the skill accumulation, the environment, the ability to have an expat assignment, that's worth it to me. But I think where you really see the snag is there a misalignment between what is represented as a total package and what the candidate will accept? And you know, that's inherent upon everyone, because you guys have to source multiple candidates, and presumably everyone that you present to the board of directors or to the CEO or whomever is sort of charged of hiring, they're assuming that everyone is within the range that they pre-established for you.
And how do you deal with, like, when we get, the candidates towards the end, right? And we're trying to figure out equity and things like that. Is it fair to say people have to start disclosing certain pieces of information so we can get to the right place, provided that we all agree we're in the range?
Yeah. Okay. So if we're within the range,
yeah,
I am absolutely comfortable disclosing your equity holdings, your walk away.
Yeah, exactly.
I am not a big fan of disclosing your current compensation.
Yeah.
And I see it as, I coach my clients to know that they can accept the role within the range.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Can you accept the role within the range? Maybe 10% above the range, but because there's extenuating circumstance. But if you could accept the role within the range, then we're talking about, how can we sort of move within that? And you will hear me always talk. I mean, people who have advised, I always talk about vertical parity and horizontal parity. Vertical parity is within the enterprise. Where do I fit within that enterprise? CEO, CFO, CLO, and then positions below it. Horizontal parity is, if it's a public company, I'm looking at the peer group that's right there in the proxy. So, I wish I could say it's rocket science. It's not rocket science. There's some nuance to it. But if you have a peer group of companies, and if you're fortunate that the CLOs pop up, that gives you sort of a nice starting point.
Yeah, good. And the last thing I'll ask them, just keeping our eye on the time, is, can you give us an example of maybe a particularly tough negotiation, but also maybe where, the range was agreed in the beginning, but it was really below market and folks weren't understanding each other? I guess really what your role is, were you negotiating on behalf of that? And you sort of started out saying with GCs, it's a little different, right? Do you negotiate? How is the search firm involved? Which I think you talked about more as a mediator almost.
Well, with GCs,
Yeah.
I always give GCs the opportunity to do the negotiations themselves, because a lot of times this is sort of the first opportunity to show their negotiation chops and, you know, how they interact under stress. And we sort of work together to come up with a plan, to come up with a game plan that leads them into negotiation. And I'm there to sort of help them with the language to make certain that they advocate without being offensive.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you know, I've had situations. I recently had a situation with someone who was going to be president of a health system, and he was going to be reporting to the EVP of the university. I was handling the negotiations, and I had a pretty good sense of what his worth was. And more importantly, he had a good sense of what his worth was. And when we countered with that, the EVP, you know, showed great umbrage and just couldn't believe we were asking that. Now, look, listen, we're all big boys and big girls. We all, you know how to negotiate. But this particular client did not care for that, because intuitively, and I shared my view that, you know, this may be a great position, but I don't know if you want to report to this guy. That negotiation showed us something about what that position would be like. So when, you know, I said, yeah, I don't know that, you know, I mean, he didn't need to take the job. And all along, his spouse had been advising him against taking the job, because she went to an event where they brought them both up, and she said, I don't like the EVP. So, you know, and for what it's worth, by the way, you know, Heather, you may know this, but oftentimes, and please don't report me to the, you know, Board of Professional Responsibilities, but oftentimes when I'm talking to clients, I will say, if you want to have your spouse or significant other on that call with me, have them join, because these are sort of lifetime decisions.
Yeah.
These are career.
Sometimes you're too close to it.
Yeah. So sometimes it's good for the spouse to be in that dialogue.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. All right. I know everyone also wants to hear about the private company side of all of this, so I'll shift it over to Casey so you all can tell us more on that. Thanks, John. That was awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate that, John. And we know the private company side can be a little more
opaque,
confusing. We'll go with confusing. So let's talk high level, right? When we talk private company, you know, what are we talking about here, right? What does private mean to you?
So private means, well, so I'll tell you what private means. I mean, it means a non-publicly traded company, and it means anything from a VC-backed company to a PE, private equity portfolio company, or a family-owned portfolio company. I do not get involved typically in negotiations with VC-backed companies, just because, one, you know, they don't hire a lot of lawyers. And two, they just tend to be small, and, you know, my rates are what they are. But for PE-backed portfolio companies, you can, you know, it's the range. So, I mean, there are literally thousands of private equity funds. Each comes with one or more philosophies on how they will compensate their operating officers. So a lot of it is sort of trying to kind of dig within that company and figure out, okay, this is a different world. How do I adjust to that? And just like I said, the adjustment of going from a law firm to a public company is a huge adjustment. The adjustment of going from a public company to a PE portfolio company can be equally as daunting.
And on that point, what is the biggest difference you see in those negotiations, private compared to public?
Well, just the lack of information. You know, when I start out with a public company candidate, I can usually put together sort of the components of the offer pretty easily and pretty straightforward. in a private company context, the game is about equity. So there's, you have to, on the one hand, make certain that the candidate is comfortable not seeing and not having available the cash that they may have typically become accustomed to. The base pay is lower. The equity that you get is typically illiquid. So, that is a lifestyle adjustment. That is a lifestyle adjustment. And you're not going to go in there and say, well, I made X at public company Y, because they will say, well, that's not what this game is about. What this game is about is equity. And you have to be comfortable with that. And you have to be comfortable being able to live your life without that cash that you may have become accustomed to.
And with that in mind, what do you advise people when they're thinking about going to a private company from a public company? What should their thought process be?
One, can you assess the viability of the company? I mean, here's the thing. When you go into a private company, you are rolling the dice that there's going to be an exit between 3, 5, maybe 7 years. And if there's not that exit, you will have foregone real cash and real equity from your public company. So, sort of the first thing is, am I equipped to evaluate the potential success of a medical device company? Am I equipped to evaluate the potential success of, an integrated IT company? Because if the company doesn't succeed and the company doesn't have a successful exit, you have lost 3 to 5 years of your earning potential. Period, full stop. So the first thing I would advise is, are you comfortable that this is the right place for you and that there will be a successful exit? Assuming that's the case, how successful do you want to be on exit? Do you want to be like, oh, this is great, and I'm pocketing a couple mil and I'm gonna chill for a while? Or is it like moving to Saint-Tropez and I'm out, I'm done? And so that's really kind of the question. That's really the question, is what do I want to get out of this? And is this the vehicle to help me do that?
And when you're working with your clients, how do you evaluate that equity, right? Do you have a manner in which you do it? Do you have any, tips and tricks or specialty to look at private equity backed companies and how you, compare that to a cash value?
Well, I always sort of start with, the cap table, because I want to see how much is going to be available, assuming there's some kind of management incentive plan, a management equity plan, to sort of see what's the range and where my client would fall within that range. If the company has done what's called a 409A valuation, which is an annual valuation that has to be done of the total value of the company and the equity value of individual equity units, if they've done that, that gives us a great starting point. Okay, so what I'm sort of trying to do is kind of back into a value of the equity, or a value of the range of equity that I can ask for, and still not be offensive. Okay, I feel it is extremely important, particularly for GCs, CLOs, to say, I have skin in the game. Because you are, it's one thing if you work for Comcast and the CEO is pocketing millions and millions of dollars. It's another thing if you work for a PE portfolio company and the CEO is bringing in 300,000 a year and crossing her fingers that there's going to be an exit. All right, so you can't come in there, and say, well, I need to be safe, so I've got to make 400,000 to be safe. You've got to be willing to say, okay, I'm going to make less cash because I have confidence that this entity will have an exit that will be profitable. And then we have to go into that cap table and make certain that you're properly placed within that cap table so you could be successful at that exit.
And then my last question, because I know we want to get to all the questions because we're getting a lot. Uh, is there advice you give to people at different points in their career, whether it makes sense to join a private company with, an exit that might be 3, 5, 7 years on the horizon?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, if you've got a mortgage and you're still funding the 529 plan for your kids, maybe not the best move for you. It is it's something that it's almost like New York. New York, you better be young or you better be wealthy. Other than that, it's a tough place to live. And I view PE the same way, is that if you are young and you kind of can roll the dice on something for 3 or 4 years, and it's great. Or if you've been very fortunate, and I've had clients who are very fortunate to have had successful careers in public companies, and now they're just looking for a chance to do something they find interesting. And look, listen, maybe you're just someone who is very, very frugal and is willing to take the chance, and you know how much you need for every particular aspect of your life, and you are willing to take this chance. But I mean, the big thing to keep in mind is that cash will not be available at the same level. So you have to be at a stage in your life and your career where you can absorb that risk.
All right, so we're going to jump into the questions because there's a lot. And I'm just one that just came up, I think makes sense to add here. How often will a PE company share their 409A report or their cap table? Is that something that you push for? Are they willing to do, or do you see them push back on that?
I think they're very willing to share well, I shouldn't say very willing. I think if you're going to be the general counsel, you're going to see that cap table because you're going to be largely responsible for maintaining that cap table. So they typically will share that. Now, if you're coming in as an associate GC, 3 levels from the top job, probably not. But if you're coming in at the GC CLO level, it is a reasonable ask, and I would be a bit skeptical of a company that's not willing to share it. The same with the 409A valuation. I mean, the 409A valuation is done by an independent third party. It is really, it truly is sort of the capitalization of the company, the market cap of the company, and they should be willing to share that with you. If they're not, you should kind of make a mental note of that.
I think it goes back to your example. In the negotiation, you're learning a lot about who you're going to be working with again.
Exactly. A ton about the counterparty.
Yeah. I'm learning so much. I think I froze, but I'm learning so much. This is awesome. So John, this is maybe just an overview type of question, but we hear a lot about compensation culture. And I want to start there because I think that's helpful as we start diving into some of these other questions folks are asking us. What is compensation culture? Why does it matter in negotiations? How should people think about it?
It's just it's a catchphrase for you are in an industry, no matter, whatever job you take, you are in an industry, and that industry has norms. If that industry is tech in Silicon Valley, the norm is equity. If that industry is banking and financial services, the norm would be, cash, but heavily incentivized bonus, with some equity as well. And what people often get confused if they cross industries is thinking, okay, I was paid this way when I was at a manufacturing firm in Kansas, and now I'm going to a tech firm in Northern California. Why aren't they paying me the same way? This is what I made, this is what I'm worth. Well, that's not their culture. And what I try to do, as we're working together, is to sort of give the candidate the language to speak the language of the culture. So if the CEO has a lot of equity at stake, again, you've got to say, I'm willing to pull that wagon with you. I'm willing to, make less, guaranteed to pull that wagon with you. And if that's the way everyone, the norms of the culture, then you have to acclimate yourself to that.
Mhm.
That's the easiest way to get to talk yourself out of a job. You could have all the competence in the world, but if you do not speak their language, they're going to move to the next candidate.
Yeah. And we see this a lot. I mean, and we try to, in the beginning of the conversations, to the extent we can, if we know that they're heavy on equity or they're going to be heavier on cash, we try to have that conversation with people so they understand. People always say to us, oh, but I'm making 70% in equity, or I'm making 50%, or, and this company is paying 20%, but heavier on cash. So just things to think. So
The example I always give is, you're not Jamie Dimon.
right.
They're not changing their culture for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Good. All right, Case, next one.
Yeah. So John, in these negotiations, if it's a good offer, the first offer, something you love, do you always recommend negotiating? Is pushing back something you say you should always do, or is there a time where you say, take it, this is perfect?
Well, typically what will happen is if once I'm retained, the first thing I do, and whether you're using me or someone like me or you're doing it yourself, is you should kind of have all these numbers in your mind, and you should have had those numbers as a product of research. Okay, so you should know, okay, CLO company has a market cap of $6 billion. These are the peers. The package should be, 750 bonus and 1.5 equity. Okay, so you've done all that work, right? And then they come in with an offer that is like 8, 8, and 1.6. We're done. We're done. Okay, I don't believe in negotiating for the sake of negotiation. I believe in negotiating to protect your downside and to make certain that you are fairly compensated. And if you're fairly compensated, now, will I look at the downside? Yes, we will look at the severance pay provisions. We'll look at potential restrictive covenants. But if the number is right, then, let's get you lined up and do the press release and, start working.
Good. Good.
And a follow on to that, is there a point in the conversation where you recommend to start pushing back, right? Is it early on? Is it late in the process? Like, when do you advise your people to say, I think it's going to need to be more, or just some sort of pushback on the offer?
Okay. It like many things, it depends. One of the things that we try to do, and anyone should try to do, is once you kind of come up with that first iteration of your strategy of what the 4 corners of the agreement should look like, the next thing you should do is prioritize. Okay. And maybe the priority is monetary, maybe it's non-monetary. But, if the first 6 things in the agreement are great and the 7th thing is not perfect, you got to think long and hard about whether or not that's where you want to expend your energy. I always say, do we want to use our arrows here? But if it's one of those priority items, and I always ask clients, please tell me what your priority is. If I'm doing the negotiation, please tell me what your priority is, because I do not want to spend a lot of time hammering away at remote work, right? And then find out that your real issue was that you didn't like the you didn't like the job description, and you wanted this additional piece added to your portfolio.
This is so good, because we tell people a lot, like, first of all, you negotiate all at once, but sort of exactly what you just said. So it's confirming, and that's awesome. So all right, so we've got a lot of questions. So what unique elements of a negotiation do you need to consider when a company IPOs, shifting from private to public?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of times that's going to be baked in, because you're going to be part of a management team.
Yeah.
There are some, there may be some nuances, and maybe you may have the opportunity as you go through certain funding rounds. Maybe you're in there, you're embedded. There's a new funding round. They offer new employment agreements with the anticipation of a future IPO. So, you begin to think, well, will my equity accelerate on a single trigger? Typical single trigger is the change in control, which an IPO would be. Or is there a requirement that there be a double trigger? And that's something that people always think about. And that's sometimes when I represent management teams, like right now, I'm literally right now representing a CEO and 3 members of upper management who are instrumental in the buyout. We've agreed to a double trigger because they absolutely insisted on one. But I know for a fact, typically the lawyer is the first person to get canned, especially if you're, if it's an IPO, maybe you could survive. But if it's like, if you're in a PE company and you're going to a strategic buyer, they may already have their legal staff in place. They don't need another CLO. So on the IPO thing, I'm looking at the double triggers. I'm looking at, maybe for lawyers, not as much restrictive covenants, but, a lot of times, that may be something that they try to secure. It just varies.
And how do you think of severance compensation and severance packages?
We have a lot of questions on that, just so you know.
Yeah.
So severance, if at all possible, you try to get it going in. You try to nail it down going in. And I view equity as a significant portion of severance. And a lot of times PE funds want to say, well, if you sever, you're out of luck. That isn't my approach. And my approach is, if I've helped create value and I'm not here for the exit event, I still want to hold on to some portion of my equity, if not all of my equity. Something else that I tend to focus on is, as you guys know, oftentimes you will get equity or you'll get cash to buy you out of your current role. Okay, well, if you get severed, so let's say I'm at 3M and I've got 1.2 million in unvested equity that I lose by going to your firm, going to your company. Well, if I get severed and it's not for cause, it's not I resigned, they woke up and said, here's your cardboard box, get out of here. And you want to make me forfeit the equity you gave me, that's one thing. But the equity that I brought over and that bought me out of 3M, I expect to keep. So, that's just something to keep in mind, that, all equity isn't created equal. There's certain equity that you really, really have a greater entitlement to, and you need to protect that in severance. And the other piece about severance, again, not as germane for this audience, but a typical severance package, you're talking about some component of base, bonus, equity, and continued medical. And, to the extent that you could lock those in on the way in, when everybody loves you, that's when you do it.
Yeah. Casey, it's my turn, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm repeating. This is so good. Okay, so John, and this is maybe, can you pre-negotiate a minimum percentage year-over-year salary increase? Does that answer depend on a public or a private company?
For the most part, again, to use the Jamie Dimon, short of being Jamie Dimon, probably not. In a public company, one, you're going to have a comp consultant out there. And the last thing that comp consultants want to see, and to go even a layer beyond that, the last thing that proxy advisory firms want to see is guaranteed compensation. They always want to see your pay aligned with the pay and the performance, aligned with the performance of the enterprise. So trying to pre-negotiate, 5% increase every year, again, either you're Jamie Dimon or I almost said Patrick Mahomes, but I meant to say Jalen Hurts. unless you're one of those folks, and I am speaking to you from Philadelphia as a reminder.
Yeah.
So unless you're one of those folks, that just isn't going to happen. And in a PE portfolio company, they're not in the business of guaranteeing anything. They're just not, that's not their business model. That's not what they would do. So, you know, I always try to kind of caution people against asking questions that indicate that they're not aligned with the culture, and that might indicate that.
And I actually, Casey, can I just ask a follow-up, because it just came in, it's on the bottom, and it goes right with what John just said, if that's okay. So
Of course.
you just gave one example of when the company will want to move to the next candidate when they're not speaking the same language. And the question is, what are other pitfalls to avoid when you don't want to risk losing an offer?
I think tone is very, very important.
Yeah.
Okay. I am by trade a tax lawyer. I am not a litigator. This is not the time to use your litigator voice. This is not the time to use your outside voice. Okay, because people are assessing whether or not they want to be in a room with you sometimes for 48 hours straight. And, you know, you are trying to show that you are a good negotiator, but you're also trying to show that you could be a good teammate. And, you know, there's sort of the substance of it, but there's also the approach. You know, if again, I would typically would not be negotiating on the part of a lawyer. I'd be negotiating for someone, a non-lawyer, but I feel I'm there to represent them. And I feel that it's my role to make them look good, to make the company feel, okay, well, you know, he was pleasant to deal with, so candidate X is probably going to be pleasant to deal with. And, you know, you could, you know, the old saying, you know, you could disagree without being disagreeable. So that to me is the biggest pitfall. Other than just like being ill-informed and not respectful of the culture.
Okay. That's great. Thanks.
Following that train of thought, you know, when is the time you recommend people to walk away, where you say it's just not going to work?
You know, it's different. We talked about priorities. So
Yeah.
let's say, and this happens oftentimes, you have a kid in high school and the position requires you to do a reload. And you've gone to the, you know, you've gone to the mat about how you want to do remote. And, you know, you can't bridge that. You know, these decisions are not made in a vacuum. They're made in the context of family, and they're made in the context of your overall happiness. And if you are unhappy, you are not going to be good at your job very long. So if that's a bridge that we can't cross, then, you know, we kind of have to walk away. And it doesn't make the company a bad place to say, we want you on site at headquarters. Because, you know, a lot of CEOs say, I want my CLO to be within his arm's reach. And I think increasingly, as CLOs have become more part of the brain trust, P&L, strategic, that is going to be the case. And if you can't bridge that, then, you know, you may have to walk away. The other thing is, money is money. And if the money isn't right, and I don't, you know, I think by the time most people get to me, they've already gone through you guys, and hopefully, you know, they've already socialized that. But sometimes you kind of can't get to where you need to be, or the buckets aren't filled in a way you need to have the buckets filled. The last one that I have advised people to walk away on is I am, again, this may not happen as much with lawyers, but you oftentimes hear, well, we're creating this new position for you because, you know, this is a new role. Those are the hardest jobs to succeed in because there is no template. And a new CEO could come in and say, why are we paying, X million to this person for this role that didn't exist 5 years ago? Well, because that happens, I usually, if someone's getting a new role that's new to the organization, I am almost insistent on having severance. And I mean real severance. Because what people will do is when you're sort of looking at the, if you're preparing your riff, right, you're going to say, okay, who's this person to get rid of? Who can we get rid of? And if somebody's going to cost you a year of base and bonus to get rid of, then maybe you work a little bit harder to make that person successful. So there's certain circumstances where severance becomes very, very important to negotiate on the way in.
So for non-public company GCs, where their companies don't offer options like a family office owned company, private company, right? Privately owned, family owned. What do you see as a typical bonus percentage if maybe it's a $1 billion revenue company? And then what other comp elements, right, besides more cash, could folks ask for if they're not getting any sort of equity, right? And it looks like it's just a cash play at the end of the day. Depends, right?
There's not.
Yeah.
There really isn't.
Yeah.
I had a client where, and this was a situation where we had to walk away because he was coming from a company that had a significant bonus structure and a significant equity structure. And he was offered a very nice position at a very public facing company, but it was family owned. And their equity was in their company ESOP. And look, I came up as an ERISA lawyer, as a qualified plan lawyer. Love ESOPs. That's not the ballpark we're playing in. It's not the ballpark that you're playing in as a, if you're going to go into a private company, you are going in there, I would think, for the purpose of creating generational wealth. Okay, because you are rolling the dice. Well, if you're only going to roll the dice for base and bonus, that just doesn't seem, I mean, again, and maybe you're at a point where, you know what, I don't care, I'm going in there for the experience, that's fine. But, I'm not poo-pooing family-owned companies. I'm just saying you're always going to have your face pressed against the window on that.
Yeah.
Public and private, the same. When you're thinking about a GC, CLO, what other execs should people be comparing themselves to, right? If I'm going as a CLO, should I be looking at a COO salary or compensation, or should I be looking at a COO or, CFO?
Okay. So the one thing I do know is that when you guys do these things, we don't just have ladies on here. So I want to be very, very careful about what I say. Okay.
Sure.
The hierarchy is typically CEO, CFO, CLO. Now, if you're at a medical device company or you're at an early stage drug development company, it may be CEO, Chief Medical Officer, CFO. Okay. If you're at a tech company, it may be CEO, Chief Technical Officer, CFO, or vice versa. And sometimes at a tech company, that Chief Technical Officer may be a founder. So a lot of it depends upon sort of the nature. I do think, for the most part, you should be after the CFO. So I'll leave my comments at that.
Okay, sorry, I think I just lost okay, here we go. So here we go. So for public company equity negotiations, how do you negotiate timing for vesting and other items if presumably an equity plan has already been approved for the C-suite? You don't.
That's pretty tough.
Yeah.
That's pretty tough. Now, what you can do is if you have a good rationale for why you need sign-on equity, oftentimes there'll be a carve out on the sign-on equity, and that may be treated as differently. That may go into a different bucket than the regular equity. But again, this kind of goes to the culture, right? You know, if everyone has agreed to 3-year incremental vesting, it's going to be hard for you to move off of that. So you kind of have to develop a rationale. Again, I think if they're buying you out of equity, that equity has to be protected. That vesting schedule is different. What I would say is it never hurts to ask, but you know, I still do represent a lot of employers, and you know, my natural inclination is going to be no, because we're all rowing this boat together, and we should, you know, the oars should weigh the same for all of us.
John, I have a question that I know Heather and I run into a lot about post-employment restrictive covenants, but you're going to have a different answer for the general counsel, CLO, and our non-legal folks on this call. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you know, I guess that you know, last year everyone was running around like, oh, there are going to be no more non-competes, no more non-competes. So we saw where that went. So, you know, non-competes are here. They're here to stay, except for our friends in California and a couple other states. You know, regardless of how you feel about them, your counterparty is going to ask for them. As lawyers, I feel we have an ethical off-ramp to say ethically we are prohibited from entering into non-competes. And to the extent that you, as a lawyer or outside counsel, have asked me to sign a non-compete, arguably breaches your ethical obligations. And people will fight that back and forth, back and forth. But, you know, there's 2 stages, right? One, I'm trying to get out of the contract. And if, in fact, the client does leave, you have to try to enforce that. And you're going to have to try to enforce that in a court where a judge, who's also a lawyer, is going to say, no, I don't think so. Now, does that mean that, you know, they can't attach it to some of your equity programs and that they can't, you know, those are some of the things that could be done. For the non-lawyers in the room, non-competes are viable. I think they should be paired with severance. I think, and again, I'm not a trade secret non-compete attorney. I mean, we have a whole slew of folks who do that stuff every day on the regular. But in terms of negotiation, I do feel that if there's a business purpose for the non-compete, if we limit it to both scope and duration, and if it squares with the severance, then, you know, I think that's a fair ask and that's a fair trade-off.
We've gotten a couple questions around the resources available to research private sector. You've talked a little bit about this compensation, executive compensation.
Yeah, that's really, really tough. I mean, look, if you think it's hard to get the cap table for a company, imagine trying to get survey data. Now, there are certain surveys that you can buy. And I don't want to mention them because they're competitors of MLA, but they're surveys that you can buy, okay? Yeah. But I think one of the things that's probably most instructive is, let's say you're at a portfolio company and you've seen the 498 valuation and the company's valued at $2 billion. And it is in heavy manufacturing. Well, if you look hard enough, you could find a $2 billion market cap company in heavy manufacturing that's publicly traded. If you do enough work, you can actually find that. And you might be able to find comparatives there. Also, if you find that and the lawyers on the chief legal officer is an NEO, you can pull up his or her contract. So sometimes you look at parallel companies that are publicly traded and use those as references. Or you could try to buy a survey data, which may or may not be up to date. Or if you have any intel in the industry. I mean, at the very onset, we talked about knowing the industry that you were in. So talk to people.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, you don't necessarily have to tell them, hey, I'm thinking about taking a job at, portfolio company X, but you could certainly talk to people about, what happens within that sector. The other approach to take is, oh, I hear you work for a Carlyle portfolio company. How does Carlyle feel about compensating its lawyers? What do you know about that? Because there are certain big players, and if you're going to one of their portfolio companies, you may be able to network with someone who's within another portfolio company and use that as a reference.
Mhm. Good. Okay. Awesome. We have time for one more.
John, yeah,
John, you
before we
doing
run out of
okay?
time,
You've talked for an hour straight.
yeah, no, I want to, this isn't a plug for John. It's a question we got, and I think it's a valid one. This has all been about general counsel compensation and other, C-suite executives. And obviously your time is valuable and you're a valuable add to any negotiation. Does it make sense to, work with you at an AGC or DGC level offer, right? Engage you at that level and not just GC.
Some DGCs, yes. I mean, if you're going to be a DCG for a Fortune 200 company,
Yeah.
I think it makes sense because you'll probably have 30 or 40 lawyers reporting up to you. And what it also does is it preps you for that next step, which is the actual GC role. So I would say in the right context, it does make sense. Associate General Counsel, no. No is a complete sentence on that, guys. I'm not adding.
We're not waiting for
The answer
another.
to no.
Good. John, this has been so awesome. As always, I just get to speak for myself. I learned a ton on this. So thank you so much for your time and just for giving us all this great information. And thanks to everybody who joined us. We're so happy to have you. And we're sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but sure there will be a rock star part, whatever, coming up soon. So thanks everybody. And John, thank you again. And Casey, thank you.
Thanks, John. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate
Heather,
it.
great to see you as always. Bye-bye.
Bye.